You just got time slipped out of your climate-controlled apartment, your soft mattress, and your little, "I'm too tired for drama" life, and dumped straight into medieval England, where the air smells like wet wool, wood smoke, and bad decisions. No hot shower, no clean water on demand, no cozy thermostat, just a crowd, a rope, and a legal system that looked at betrayal and said, "Let's make this everybody's problem." Welcome to the world of high treason, where England did not just punish you for turning on the crown. It made an example out of you with a sentence so brutal it sounds like a fever dream: hanged, drawn, and quartered. And no, that is not some edgy tavern nickname. That was the official nightmare. Imagine your modern life for a second. You miss a payment, your phone gets locked, maybe a Karen at customer service ruins your afternoon. In medieval England, if you were accused of betraying the king, the state did not gaslight you with a warning letter. It dragged you into public, stripped you of dignity, and turned your body into a political message. That is not justice in any comforting sense. That is theater with entrails. The law behind this horror was sharpened under kings like Edward I, who ruled from 1272 to 1307, when England was busy building a more aggressive legal machine and making treason into a very expensive mistake. By the later medieval period, especially after the Treason Act of 1351 under Edward III, high treason became one of the most serious crimes in the realm. The crown wanted loyalty, obedience, and silence. If you gave it rebellion instead, it answered with a public performance of pain. And here is the part that really makes your stomach drop. The punishment was not just about killing you. Killing you would have been too merciful, too clean, too fast. Medieval justice wanted humiliation first, terror second, and death somewhere in the middle like a bonus feature nobody asked for. The rope tightens, and the crowd starts laughing. Drawing did not mean sketching your face for a wanted poster. It meant hauling the condemned through the streets, usually on a hurdle or sled, so the crowd could get a good look at the body before the rest of the sentence unfolded. Public punishment was the point. The law's brutality was not random. It was political theater with a legal stamp on it. Under Edward I, who ruled from 1272 to 1307, the English crown was tightening its grip on authority, law, and loyalty. So when the law punished traitors, it was not only avenging a crime, it was defending a hierarchy. And then there is the phrase, 3 deaths, which sounds like something a drunk monk invented after too much ale and too little sleep. But it had a very real political purpose. The condemned were not simply killed once. They were made to suffer a sequence of destruction, hanging, disembowelment, and quartering. In practice, the order could vary depending on whether the authorities wanted the victim alive for the full horror or dead before the butchery finished. Either way, the message was the same. One death was not enough for treason. The crown wanted the body broken into stages, as if the law itself were saying, "You do not get to leave this world in one piece after challenging me." That is the grim genius of the punishment. It was not only about pain. It was about control over time. First the public humiliation, then the choking, the collapse, the helplessness, then the opening of the body, then the final division into parts, sent out as warnings like cursed souvenirs. Medieval power understood something modern PR teams still pretend not to know. If you want obedience, make the consequences unforgettable. William de Marisco learned that lesson the hard way. In 1242, under Henry III, he was captured after years of outlawry and rebellion. He had become a symbol of defiance against royal authority, and the crown answered with a punishment designed to erase any romantic nonsense about noble resistance. De Marisco was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn, one of the places where England liked to turn justice into a public event. The point was not merely to kill him. It was to strip him of dignity, status, and any last illusion that the king's enemies could die cleanly. And if you are wondering whether the crowd enjoyed this, the answer is, some did, some looked away, and some probably told themselves they were there for civic duty while their stomachs tried to climb out through their throats. Public executions were messy social rituals. People came to witness punishment, but they also came because this was one of the few times the state handed out drama for free. Medieval life was short, hard, and often boring in the worst possible way. A traitor's death was the kind of spectacle that made the whole town feel briefly alive, which is a deeply cursed way to spend an afternoon. The phrase 3 deaths also worked as propaganda because it made treason sound uniquely monstrous. Ordinary criminals might be hanged. Murderers might be broken on the wheel or otherwise punished according to local custom. But traitors were in a special category because they threatened the king himself. That distinction mattered. It told everyone that the crown was not just another lord with a bigger hat. It was the center of order, and if you attacked it, the law would not merely punish you. It would make a lesson out of your remains. Now bring in Dafydd Dab Gruffydd, better known to history as Dafydd ap Gruffydd, the Welsh prince whose rebellion against Edward I ended in 1283 with one of the most infamous executions in English history. He had resisted Edward's conquest of Wales, and when he was finally captured, the punishment was not just severe. It was symbolic. Dafydd was the first recorded person in England to be subjected to the full traitor's sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering. That matters because it shows the crown was not improvising. It was testing a political weapon. Edward I needed Wales to understand what resistance would cost. Dafydd's execution was not only revenge. It was a message to conquered territory. This is what happens when you challenge the new order. The body of a prince became a warning label. Royal power was saying, in effect, you may have a title, a banner, and a cause. I have the law, the rope, the knife, and the crowd. That is the brutal logic underneath the whole thing. The punishment was calibrated to destroy more than flesh. It destroyed status. It destroyed memory. It destroyed the fantasy that noble blood could shield you from royal wrath. In a world where lineage mattered almost as much as land, that was a devastating political move. If a prince could be reduced to a public lesson, then nobody was safe. And the law loved that. Medieval law was not always about fairness in the modern sense. It was about order, hierarchy, and making sure the wrong people stayed afraid. The sentence for treason was a legal performance of domination. It told subjects that the king's authority reached beyond the courtroom and into the body itself. Your skin, your ribs, your organs, your limbs. None of it was truly yours once the crown decided you had crossed the line. That is why drawing mattered so much. It was the transition from arrest to annihilation, from person to object. You were no longer a man or woman with a name and a grievance. You were cargo. You were evidence. You were a warning being dragged through the mud. And if that sounds excessive, good. It was excessive on purpose. Medieval rulers understood that mercy could look like weakness, and weakness invited trouble. So they built punishments that were not just painful, but memorable. The law did not want you to think, that was harsh. It wanted you to think, I will never let that happen to me. By the early 14th century, this logic had become even more useful to kings who needed to keep fractured realms in line. Rebellion in Wales, unrest in England, noble feuds, border violence. Every crack in the kingdom was a chance for the crown to demonstrate that loyalty was not optional. The sentence for treason became a kind of royal branding iron. It burned the same message into every witness. The king owns the final word. Then Andrew Harclay learns mercy is just another weapon. The sentence that was meant to stick. By the late medieval and early modern period, hanging, drawing, and quartering was not some random burst of royal rage. It was a carefully staged punishment for high treason, used when the crown wanted to make an example so loud it could echo across a kingdom. The point was not just death. The point was humiliation, terror, and total political theater. And yes, it was used. Not every traitor got the full treatment, but the people who did were usually those the government wanted to crush in public and in memory. Men accused of plotting against the monarch, aiding invasion, or betraying the realm could be sentenced under statutes that treated treason as the ultimate crime against order itself. In England, the legal framework hardened over time, especially after the Treason Act of 1351 under Edward III, which helped define what counted as treason for generations. That meant the punishment was not just a medieval tantrum. It was law. Cold, deliberate law. The kind that says, we are not merely killing you. We are making sure everyone watching understands who owns the kingdom, who escaped the worst of it. Here's the ugly little loophole in the machine. Not everyone convicted of treason got the full horror show. Some were spared the most brutal elements because of rank, gender, age, or political convenience. Noblewomen, for example, were usually not hanged, drawn, and quartered in the same way men were. Instead, Women convicted of treason were often burned at the stake or otherwise executed in a manner considered more appropriate by the standards of the time. That was not mercy. That was medieval sexism dressed up as etiquette. Children and some lesser offenders could also be treated differently, though different does not mean humane. Political usefulness mattered too. If a prisoner could be turned into a bargaining chip, a confession, or a warning without the full spectacle, the crown might choose that route. The law was never just about justice. It was about leverage. Why women were treated differently. Let's not romanticize this. Women were not spared because society suddenly discovered compassion. They were treated differently because medieval and early modern law was soaked in patriarchy. A woman accused of treason was still seen as dangerous, but the state often framed her punishment through ideas of modesty, shame, and bodily propriety. Burning was considered, in the twisted logic of the time, a more fitting punishment for women because it avoided the public exposure associated with hanging and dismemberment. That is not kindness. That is gaslighting with a torch. And the double standard went deeper. Women were often punished through the lens of their relationships to men: wife, mother, daughter, accomplice, temptress, or political nuisance. Their crimes were interpreted through gendered assumptions, while men were judged more directly as threats to sovereignty. Same crime, different script. Same state violence, different costume. So when you ask why women were treated differently, the answer is simple and rotten, because the law was built by men who believed bodies had ranks, and female bodies were supposed to be controlled, hidden, or symbolically purified. Medieval justice loved a hierarchy almost as much as it loved a spectacle. The long fade of a legal horror show. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the punishment was increasingly seen as barbaric, even by people who were still perfectly comfortable with prisons, chains, and public executions. That tells you how extreme hanging, drawing, and quartering really was. If even a brutal legal culture starts side-eyeing your punishment, you have gone way past stern and straight into nightmare territory. The legal butchery began to fade through reform. In practice, the sentence was often commuted before the full ritual could be carried out. The state still wanted punishment, but it was becoming harder to defend the old theatrical mutilation as civilized governance. Public attitudes shifted. Legal reformers pushed back. The machinery of punishment was changing shape. Then came the decisive break. In 1870, the punishment was abolished in Britain. The Forfeiture Act 1870 ended the old penalties attached to treason, including the grotesque remnants of hanging, drawing, and quartering. That did not make the world kind. It did not erase prisons, executions, or state violence. But it did end one of the most grotesque legal rituals ever written into English law. And honestly, good riddance. The state had spent centuries pretending that ripping a person apart in public was a reasonable way to defend order. By 1870, that lie had finally worn thin. What abolition really meant. Abolition did not happen because people suddenly became saints. It happened because the punishment had become politically embarrassing, morally indefensible, and legally outdated. The empire wanted discipline, not medieval carnage. It wanted control without the smell of blood and the spectacle of dismemberment. That shift matters. It shows how punishment evolves when a society can no longer pretend that cruelty is the same thing as authority. The law did not become innocent overnight, but it did stop using one of its most grotesque tools. For the people who lived under the old system, that change came too late. For the ones who were executed before reform, there was no appeal, no second chance, no neat historical footnote to soften the blade. Just the rope, the crowd, and the state's favorite lie. That terror is the same thing as order. What to remember? Hanging, drawing, and quartering was a legal punishment for high treason, not random violence. It was used selectively, especially when the crown wanted a public warning. Women were usually punished differently because of gendered legal ideas, not mercy. The punishment faded through reform and was abolished in Britain in 1870. Important note: historical punishments were shaped by law, politics, and social hierarchy, not modern ideas of justice. If you want to compare them to today's legal systems, do it carefully and with context. If you want the clean version of history, this is not it. This is the part where law, fear, and spectacle all share the same dirty knife. Your neck is safe today, mostly because history ran out of rope. Cheers.